Hi, my name is Kaden Peebles, and today I'm going to be sharing my research about the implications of the Japanese government switching between legalizing and criminalizing prostitution. Now, my research required a topic that was focused on 4 categories. It had to be from a historical lens, it had to involve politics or the government, it had to involve sex, and it had to involve Asia. Thus, I have chosen the history of prostitution in Japan, and with that, I learned about the implications that the government's role has placed on the women who have been working in sex work. I realized quickly that the government's role shifted many times between legalizing and criminalizing prostitution, whether that be for their own personal economic advances or what they deemed to be military advances, but they never really had the women's best interests at heart, and this only created more problems for women. Women obviously were facing criminalization and imprisonment, their reputation was harmed, their physical safety and health was put at risk, and they were losing freedom rights. Now you may be wondering, why would the government want to hire women to work as prostitutes? Well, it was a benefit for the women because they were living in economic despair, they were living below the poverty line, and they really had no other option to support their family financially. And it was a benefit for the government because they viewed it as a need for military men, and it was a way to help support the military. It was advertised to be patriotic. So in the government's eyes, it was a win-win, but it was not a win for the women who were working as prostitutes for the government because of the risks that they faced. And for the women who chose to work in the private sector and not work through the government, they faced more risk when there was a public sector of prostitution happening because the government went out of their way to criminalize women who were not working through the government. They were arrested, and there were more risks to work in the private sector when there was a public sector happening than when there was no prostitution legalized. But let's talk about when the government first became involved in legalizing prostitution, and that's during the transatlantic slave trade. Now, during this time, colonial America was bringing in mostly Africans, but they were also bringing in some Chinese, and eventually the Chinese workers kind of quit being able to come. They quit having access to Chinese workers, so they turned to Japan. And while this period is most known for the Africans that they were bringing in to work as slaves, they were also bringing in Japanese men and women to perform hard labor for low wages. And the government in Japan became involved because they were selling the men and women and making contracts, and the idea was after X amount of years of work that the men and women would be able to return home. Now, during this time is when sex work kind of began to enter the scene. There were contracts being made for women to be sold as prostitutes, and the idea was that after X amount of years, they would also be returned to their families. Unfortunately for the women, this was not the case. They were never returned to their families. They often died in colonial America, and the promises were not always followed through. The money was not always sent to the families, but initially, Japanese families did not realize this, and when they were living below the poverty line, it seemed like the only alternative to send a daughter to work in America or colonial America in exchange for money to provide food on the table and a home. Eventually, the Japanese government noticed that there were problems with this. The contracts were not being followed, the women were not being returned to their homes when they were supposed to be. They were being beaten and starved to death, and they were often dying in the sex work exchange. And so the government made the transition from legalizing prostitution to it then being illegal, and it was illegal for quite some time. Now, at this point, prostitution did continue in Japan, but they no longer were sending women overseas into signed contract sex work. And there were brothels set up for men's pleasures, but the government began to notice some problems. There was the beginning of different sex diseases being spread, and the government really was trying to get a grasp on this. Unfortunately, medical professionals did not know a lot about these new diseases. They initially believed that it was produced in the filth of menstrual blood, and they later began to theorize that these diseases spread from a woman sleeping with multiple men, but the blame was always placed on women, and at that point, prostitutes became a threat. So while sex work was no longer legalized overseas, it was still legal in Japan, but the Ministry of Justice cabinet began receiving petitions to no longer allow and legalize prostitution, and that's when the Emancipation Edict for Female Performers and Prostitutes was placed. And at that point, there were no more brothels, but women could still work as prostitutes, but they had to obtain a license from the police. Now, like I said, there were always women working in the private sector that were not, at this point, obtaining licenses from the policemen, but then there were also women who were working in the public sector, and they were gaining licenses and continuing to work on their own, but not through a brothel. The Japanese government became involved with prostitution again after World War II, when they believed they had a new need for women to work as prostitutes. They were motivated by three main reasons. One, they wanted to curb the disease rates among soldiers. They didn't want soldiers having sexual relationships with several different women. They wanted to kind of confine and control the ratio of women. They wanted to also prevent military men from attacking women in colonial territories. They believed that the men would attack women if they did not have some sort of outlet for sex, and they felt that an answer to this would be to provide comfort women for the men. And then finally, they also wanted to decrease homosexual activity within the military. They believed that if there were women readily available, that there would be less homosexual activity. Now, I want to really emphasize that the government believed they had a need, because I think many people would agree that there was not a need to provide women for the men. Really, the only benefit is perhaps they were able to curb the disease spread rates, but the homosexual activity decrease and the idea that men needed sex and needed women provided for them in order to not attack colonial women is absolutely absurd, to be quite frank. But nonetheless, the government became involved, and they began petitioning ads for women to work as sex workers for the military men. The government's need for comfort women transitioned after the war from needing women for the Japanese military to needing women for the American soldiers who were occupying Japan territory. Right after the Japanese emperor declared defeat and the war was kind of coming to an end, there were instantly rumors that the American soldiers were going to take the Japanese men to America to work as slaves, and that they were going to take the Japanese women to work as sex slaves. And so the Japanese government believed that if they were able to provide women for the American men, that perhaps they would not do the things that were being rumored. This was all fear-based. From that point, the Recreation Amusement Association, or the RAA, really developed within the government, and the goal was to provide sex workers to the American soldiers as a relief. But the problem with this is that the main goal was to protect the Japanese citizens from the American soldiers, and they believed they could do that by providing comfort women. But the women themselves were Japanese citizens, and they were put in very risky situations that were not safe, and their health was put at risk, their freedom was put at risk, at the cost of potentially saving the rest of the Japanese population as a whole. And this was all done through fear-based rumors. And so the RAA began receiving petitions to disband, and eventually they disbanded in 1946. At one point, they had over 70,000 women working, and when they disbanded, they had over 55,000 women. So these were several women. We're not just talking about a small group here of women that were forced to give up their lives and sell sex as a patriotic motive. It was advertised to be, and their lives were put at extreme risk. And this was a poor decision made on the Japanese government's part by thinking that they were going to help the community as a whole, and instead they were hurting a large percent of the population, the women who were working. After the RIA was disbanded, women continued to work in the private sector, especially women who had been working in the public sector of prostitution. They then transitioned to the private sector, meaning that they continued to work as prostitutes just against the government laws. Women could make 40,000 yen per month working in the private sector, which was astronomically more than what they could make working in an office. They could make about 2,000 yen per month compared to 40,000 yen, and they would make even less working in a factory. Office and factory jobs were scarce, and it was hard for women to find jobs. And they also received other forms of payment working in the private sector of prostitution from the American soldiers, such as cash, silk stockings, or American chocolates. And this option to work freely and not with the government really allowed women to monopolize the market. They were able to keep their entire profit. They didn't have to split any money made with brothel managers or the government. So there were a lot of benefits to working despite the health and safety and freedom risk. Women also really struggled to find jobs if they had been working in the public sector of prostitution for the government during the post-war period, because they were publicly shamed for their work as prostitutes. They struggled to find work elsewhere, and they were forced to continue working illegally because there was no job opportunities. The job market was slim, and women who did have a job weren't making a lot of money, and they were not guaranteed protection by the labor standard laws. They were not viewed as valuable workers compared to men, so they were often fired more often. And the government really did not consider the women that they had hired and then fired as sex workers. During this point, American troops continued to occupy Japan, and women continued to work illegally. As women continued to work illegally, police began arresting women working in prostitution. They were known as Panpan, and when they were arrested, they were taken to hospitals where doctors would examine them for their virginity, which there's no way to determine if a woman is a virgin or not. So they based this diagnosis of virginity or not on how the women spoke and how they dressed, and if they could not make a final decision, then they would hold the women in the hospital for 3 days until their symptoms would subside if they had any. The problem is, though, that many women who were not participating in the selling of sex work were arrested. So the idea that a woman would likely be arrested, whether she was participating or not, she would likely be punished, meant that the potential of punishment did not deter women, and women knew that they were going to be arrested, so they thought, I might as well work as a prostitute and make the money. The risks were no longer as relevant. So upon conclusion of my research, I realized a few things. I realized that the government never had the women's best interest at heart. They were mostly concerned with military advances, and they did it under the guise of the Japanese population's best interest. But a large percent of that population were the women who were being hired, and their physical safety and their physical health and their emotional health were never considered. And then when prostitution was deemed illegal, these same women were criminalized. The same women that the government had been hiring, they were now placing in jail and fining and making them quarantine in hospitals. So the government never considered the women. And because of this, criminalization never really deterred women from working as sex workers. And it's just an unfortunate cycle between legalizing and criminalizing. There's no clear answer as to what the government should have done other than they should have considered the women more. Thank you so much for watching. I would like to thank my professor, Dr. Zach Smith. He has been amazing in helping me learn about this. Before my research, I knew nothing about Japan, and I'm still learning, but he has helped me learn about Japan and all of the different government and political and sex issues that are happening even in modern day Japan and the rest of modern day Asia. So I would like to give him a huge thanks as he's helped me learn about these issues that I knew nothing about before.